During a Senate committee hearing that was already brimming with tension, J.D. Vance took his seat, knowing full well the kind of reactions his line of questioning might provoke. Over the past few months, Vance had earned a reputation for being direct, even unapologetic, in how he approached issues like government accountability, defense spending, and oversight of intelligence agencies. To some, this made him a rising voice of reason and reform. To others, especially longtime members of Congress who had grown used to a certain way of doing business, it made him a thorn in the side. The particular hearing in question revolved around budget allocations and national security. But as is often the case in Washington, the conversation veered into broader territory. Vance, true to form, had been pressing hard on a sensitive issue: the use of taxpayer funds by intelligence agencies without sufficient congressional oversight. He raised pointed questions about how billions were being funneled into opaque programs, with limited documentation or public accountability. He wasn't making baseless accusations, he was quoting audit reports, inspector general warnings, and even the testimonies of former agency officials who had expressed concern about the lack of transparency. What made his questions uncomfortable wasn't just their content, but the timing. At a moment when most lawmakers were falling in line behind the usual narratives about national security, Vance was bucking the trend. He wasn't doing it for headlines. He wasn't reading off grandstanding speeches. His tone was measured, his words carefully chosen, but they carried weight. He asked why the Pace's Senate continued to approve massive appropriations for agencies that refused to disclose their internal expenditures. He inquired about whistleblower protections, questioning why so many government employees feared retaliation for raising legitimate concerns. And perhaps most pointedly, he asked why Congress, which is supposed to act as a check on executive power, had allowed itself to become a rubber stamp for whatever the intelligence community requested. That's when the friction started. Some members of the committee shifted in their seats. Others looked down, suddenly preoccupied with notes or documents. But the tension fully broke when Adam Schiff responded. Schiff, a senior member of the House Intelligence Committee and a well-known figure in national security discussions, took clear offense to Vance's approach. He argued that the questioning undermined national trust in the institutions tasked with keeping the country safe. Schiff defended the agencies vigorously and said the kind of rhetoric Vance was using could embolden America's enemies. The room grew quieter as Schiff's tone sharpened. He accused Vance without naming him directly, at first of stirring doubt, of sowing division. Then, more directly, he called Vance a jerk, clearly frustrated by the persistent and uncomfortable line of questioning. But the moment was not just about a personal insult. It symbolized the larger discomfort Washington insiders feel when the spotlight is turned back on them. Vance's insistence on accountability wasn't performative. It reflected a deeper concern about a system that increasingly shielded itself from scrutiny, while demanding unwavering loyalty from the public. By raising these questions, Vance was reasserting a core function of his role as a senator, to act as a check on concentrated power, even if that power resides in places that traditionally escape scrutiny, such as intelligence agencies. He wasn't attacking the concept of national security. He was asking whether the mechanisms designed to protect that security were being used appropriately and whether Congress was doing its job in keeping them honest. In doing so, Vance reignited a conversation many in Washington would prefer remain dormant. He brought attention to the often blurred line between security and secrecy, between legitimate operations and unchecked authority. He reminded the room that oversight isn't optionally, it's a constitutional duty. And while some viewed his method as confrontational, others recognized it as a necessary challenge to a status quo that had grown far too comfortable with silence and rubber stamps. That's why. Long before the moment of personal insult arrived, the tension had already been building. Vance had done what many politicians hesitate to do: ask hard questions with real consequences. Not to embarrass, not to provoke, but because the American people deserve answers. As the hearing unfolded, and J.D. Vance continued pressing for answers regarding government accountability and intelligence oversight, it became clear that not everyone in the room was comfortable with the direction he was taking things. Vance wasn't yelling or making personal attacks, he was doing something far more unsettling to entrenched figures in Washington, asking uncomfortable, direct questions that exposed the cracks in a system many had grown used to navigating without much resistance. Adam Schiff, who has long positioned himself as a defender of national security and the intelligence community, appeared particularly irritated by Vance's persistence. Schiff has spent years cultivating a reputation as a serious voice on matters of surveillance, foreign interference, and classified programs, but to someone like Vance, who came into office on a promise to challenge business as usual, in Washington titles and reputations weren't enough to dodge accountability. Schiff may have expected his authority to speak for itself, but Vance wasn't interested in accepting generalities or political platitudes. He wanted specifics, he wanted clarity, and he wasn't afraid to be blunt in pursuit of both. Asterisk, as Vance laid out a series of methodical questions, some regarding financial audits, others about civil liberties, protections, shifts, patience, visibly thinned. What began as subtle sighs and disapproving glances soon became open irritation. Schiff interrupted at one point, attempting to reframe the conversation and divert attention away from Vance's line of inquiry, but Vance held firm, simply redirecting the discussion back to the need for transparency and oversight. Asterisk, that's when Schiff dropped the pretense and went personal. Asterisk, with the eyes of the room on both men and cameras rolling, Schiff leaned forward, and breaking from the procedural decorum that typically governs such meetings, flatly called J.D. Vance a jerk. There was no masking it as a joke, no dressing it up in sarcasm. The word landed with an edge of real frustration. Schiff wasn't just disagreeing with Vance's views, he was expressing personal disdain. Asterisk, it was a stunning departure from the tone usually expected in such high-level discussions. In most cases, even the fiercest political disagreements remain cloaked in formality. Lawmakers are trained to attack ideas, not personalities. But in that moment, Schiff chose to abandon that standard. It wasn't about policy anymore. It was about ego, about a sense that Vance had crossed a line simply by refusing to play along. Asterisk. What made the comment especially telling was the context in which it occurred. Schiff had not refuted Vance's points with counter-evidence. He hadn't offered a detailed explanation or defended the agencies with data or documents. Instead, he resorted to an insult, one that seemed aimed more at silencing Vance than responding to him. Asterisk, the word jerk wasn't just dismissive, it was an attempt to reframe the conversation entirely. By labeling Vance that way, Schiff hoped to portray him as unreasonable, disrespectful, or disruptive. But in doing so, he inadvertently highlighted the exact dynamic Vance had been trying to expose. That raising serious questions about power and accountability often gets met with defensiveness and personal attacks, rather than thoughtful answers. Asterisk 2. Many observers, Schiff's outburst revealed just how resistant some establishment figures are to scrutiny. When confronted with persistent demands for transparency, they don't double down on facts, they double down on personal politics. In calling Vance a name, Schiff might have thought he was putting an end to the exchange. But in reality, he handed Vance something far more powerful, an example of how thin-skinned Washington can be when challenged by someone who refuses to play by its unspoken rules. Asterisk, what struck those watching wasn't just that Schiff made the comment, but that he did so in front of an audience that included other lawmakers, staff, and reporters. It laid bare a dynamic many Americans already suspect exists behind closed doors, where challenging the system is less about facts and more about personalities, and where being labeled difficult is often just the cost of asking real questions. Asterisk 4. Vance, the moment didn't require retaliation or escalation. The insult, though clearly unprofessional, only underscored his point, that when you push against power, it often pushes back not with answers, but with contempt. Asterisk, when Adam Schiff called J.D. Vance a jerk during the hearing, it could have easily turned into a heated shouting match. That kind of exchange is, unfortunately, not uncommon in today's political climate. But what happened next set the moment. Apart, Vance didn't react with anger or a personal insult in return. He didn't raise his voice, wave his arms, or appeal to partisan applause. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, adjusted the microphone, and said calmly, "If telling the truth makes me a jerk, then maybe Washington needs more of them." It was a sentence that landed not with fire, but with weight. That one line did what a 5-minute speech couldn't. It reframed the entire moment in a single breath. Rather than defending himself against the label Schiff had tried to stick on him, Vance accepted it but on his own terms. He didn't deny that his words were blunt. He didn't retreat from the position he had taken. He simply pointed out the uncomfortable truth that in a place like Washington, honesty often gets mistaken for hostility. Asterisk, the simplicity of his response was what made it so effective. Vance didn't turn the hearing into a performance. He didn't need to. By staying calm and sticking to principle, he managed to expose something deeper about the way political conversations are handled in high-stakes environments. Instead of answering Vance's questions with facts, Schiff resorted to a personal jab. And instead of getting defensive, Vance used that insult to underscore the very point he'd been making all along. How disconnected Washington had become from accountability and open dialogue. Asterisk, that one sentence resonated because it wasn't just about him. It was about every person who's ever been shut down for speaking up, for asking questions that aren't convenient, for refusing to fall in line just because that's how it's always been done. Vance didn't ask for sympathy. He asked whether truth-telling should be considered a character flaw in politics. Asterisk, in a town where image and control are everything, his calm defiance stood out. It wasn't just a rhetorical win, it was a cultural one. It showed that staying composed, sticking to the issues, and not taking the bait could actually be more powerful than any comeback designed to go viral. People watching didn't see a man flustered by being insulted, they saw someone who refused to let ego get in the way of a larger point. Asterisk, That moment also revealed something important about how Vance approaches confrontation. He doesn't thrive on outrage. He doesn't rush to score points in the typical partisan style. His strength lies in knowing when to speak, and when to let someone else's words reveal more than they intended. Schiff's insult said more about Schiff's frustration than Vance's conduct, and by refusing to match that tone, Vance came away looking like the adult in the room. Asterisk in the minutes that followed, the tone of the hearing noticeably shifted. The crowd in the chamber, including other lawmakers, aides, and observers, seemed to take a collective pause. Schiff, who had intended to discredit Vance, suddenly found himself on the defensive not because of an argument he lost, but because of an insult that backfired. Asterisk Vance's sentence had done more than just neutralize an attack. It reminded everyone that sincerity, even when uncomfortable, has a place in public service. That responding with calm clarity doesn't mean weak, can actually be a kind of strength that disarms louder voices, and that in today's political climate, where posturing often wins headlines, a simple sentence delivered with conviction can still cut through the noise. Asterisk for those paying attention, the exchange was instructive. It illustrated that character is often best measured not when someone is praised, but when they're insulted. And in that moment, J.D. Vance chose not to rise to Schiff's level, but to rise above it. Asterisk, the moment J.D. Vance calmly responded to Adam Schiff's insult with a single, pointed sentence, "If telling the truth makes me a jerk, then maybe Washington needs more of them," was more than just a personal comeback. It became a symbol of a broader divide that's been growing in American politics for years. What played out in that Senate hearing wasn't just a clash between two politicians. It was a revealing glimpse into the disconnect between the Washington establishment and the rising wave of outsiders challenging it. Asterisk, Vance didn't arrive in the Senate through the typical route. He wasn't bred in the halls of elite political institutions. His background rooted in working-class Ohio, shaped by personal struggle, and defined by a growing skepticism of entrenched power, gave him a perspective that's often missing in congressional hearings. That lens is exactly what he brought to the room when he raised questions about government oversight and how intelligence agencies handle taxpayer money. He wasn't posturing for the cameras or trying to stir up controversy for its own sake. He was doing what many Americans wish more elected officials would do. Ask direct questions and demand clear answers. Asterisk, but that kind of straightforward approach tends to unsettle people who are used to operating in an environment shaped by unspoken rules, mutual backpatting, and selective accountability. In that moment, Schiff's reaction resorting to a personal insult rather than engaging with the substance of Vance's argument reflected that discomfort. It wasn't just an emotional outburst, it was a reflex from someone who saw a challenge to the normal order of things and didn't quite know how to respond. Asterisk, that exchange didn't just reflect personal animosity. It highlighted the cultural split between two ways of operating in politics. On one side stood Schiff, a polished, seasoned lawmaker who has spent years navigating the structures of Capitol Hill, often relying on process, party loyalty, and insider consensus. On the other side was Vance, a relative newcomer who refuses to treat tradition as a substitute for truth, and who carries the concerns of Americans who feel alienated by what they see as a club that serves itself more than the country. Asterisk, the difference in their perspectives was underscored by the way they each handled the conflict. Schiff chose derision, hoping perhaps to shame Vance or paint him as disruptive, but Vance chose clarity. His calm reply didn't just neutralize the insult, it reminded everyone listening that telling the truth, even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable, isn't something to apologize for. Asterisk, that contrast struck a nerve because it mirrors the conversations happening outside of Washington. Across the country, people are growing more frustrated with institutions that appear to protect themselves while evading scrutiny. Whether it's unelected bureaucracies, complex spending systems, or vague public statements that dodge accountability, there's a growing sense that the people in power are more interested in preserving their image than fixing the system. Vance's response, short as it was, captured that frustration. It acknowledged that if standing up to that system makes someone unpopular in the halls of Congress, so be it. Asterisk, it's why his words resonated far beyond the committee room. They weren't crafted for political theater, they were grounded in a truth that many Americans feel but rarely hear reflected by their elected officials. Vance gave voice to the idea that challenging the status quo shouldn't be dismissed as hostility, and that uncomfortable questions should not be met with personal attacks. Asterisk. What made the moment so revealing wasn't just the words exchanged, but what they symbolized. Schiff represented a Washington that often sees itself as above reproach, where criticism is mistaken for disrespect, and tradition is mistaken for integrity. Vance represented a newer kind of political figure, and afraid to challenge legacy thinking, and unafraid of the names he might be called in the process. Asterisk. The exchange between them became a snapshot of the broader friction between these two forces, one clinging to the comfort of political norms, and the other pushing for reform rooted in transparency and accountability. It showed that for some in Washington, being questioned feels like an attack, and for others, like Vance, being called a name is just part of the cost of refusing to back down. Asterisk. The exchange between J.D. Vance and Adam Schiff may have started as a tense moment in a Senate hearing, but its impact extended far beyond a single comment or confrontation. In many ways, it encapsulated the growing friction between traditional political insiders and the new wave of elected officials, who are less interested in maintaining appearances and more focused on exposing flaws in the system. It wasn't about party politics or personal animosity. It was about the difference between defending an institution for the sake of tradition and questioning it for the sake of the people it's meant to serve. *JDVances.com. Deliberate response to being called a jerk wasn't just a clever comeback. It was a reminder that integrity doesn't require theatrics. In an age where sensational headlines and performative outrage dominate much of the political landscape, his refusal to escalate the moment gave it even more meaning. He let Schiff's words stand on their own, and then redirected attention to what actually mattered: the truth, the need for oversight, and the duty of elected officials to ask questions, even when the answers are inconvenient. What made the moment powerful wasn't its drama, but its simplicity. Vance didn't lash out. He didn't play the victim. He simply made the case that honesty, especially in politics, shouldn't be controversial. And by doing so, he not only held his ground, but also exposed how uncomfortable some lawmakers become when faced with someone who isn't afraid to challenge the rules they've long benefited from. In a political climate where it's easy to get lost in noise, spin, and posturing, Vance's approach reminded people that leadership doesn't have to be flashy to be effective. It has to be principled. It has to be grounded in something deeper than a headline or a set. That's what he brought into that hearing room. And that's why the moment resonated with so many people watching from the outside. Whether or not you agree with J.D. Vance's positions, the incident raised a crucial question about the culture of accountability in Washington. Are we willing to tolerate tough questions, even when they come from those outside the establishment? Are we mature enough as a political system to separate criticism from contempt? Or has the culture of insider politics become so insulated that anyone who challenges it is labeled a jerk just for doing their job? Ultimately, the answer will come not from committee rooms or news coverage, but from how the public responds. And if moments like these are any indication, more and more Americans are ready for a politics that values truth over tradition, substance over sound bites, and courage over comfort. J.D. Vance didn't just speak a sentence, he held up a mirror. And for many, what they saw